Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe to the channel to stay updated with our latest stories. It was one of those nights that felt like an escape from real life, just Ethan and Mia, away from the chaos of their restaurant jobs, laughing over cocktails and dancing beneath pulsing lights. The bar buzzed with energy, and for once, they weren't co-workers or spouses just passing in the kitchen, they were lovers again, alive and light. Mia, usually careful with her drinks, let herself go, laughing louder, dancing freer, matching Ethan round for round. He watched her with a mix of admiration and desire, reminded of why he fell for her in the first place. But the night turned sharply. As he helped her into the passenger seat, she fumbled with her purse, giggling at her own clumsiness. Then, slurring slightly, her smile twisted as she leaned close and whispered, "I slept with Lucas Hayes." The words punched the air from Ethan's lungs. Before he could ask, before he could breathe, she slumped against the window, out cold.
The drive home bluered. The city lights as mir of Confusion entriet.
Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened with every mile. His wife had just dropped a bombshell between vodka and silence, and now she was asleep beside a storm she didn't even know she'd unleashed. The next morning unfolded in heavy, aching silence. Mia shuffled into the kitchen wrapped in her oversized sleep shirt, her hair tangled and her eyes bleary with sleep, completely unaware of the wreckage she'd left in her wake. Ethan had been up for hours, nursing his fourth cup of coffee laced with whiskey, trying to make sense of what he'd heard the night before. He watched her carefully, studying every twitch in her expression, every breath, hoping for some kind of guilt, a crack in her armor, but there was nothing. Just casual morning small talk, like they hadn't hit a wall the night before. When he finally asked, "Who is Lucas Hayes?" her face blanked for a moment before she brushed it off. "I was drunk, Ethan," she said, sipping her coffee like it meant nothing. People say dumb things when they're drunk. But Ethan wasn't convinced. He wasn't stupid. Sometimes, he knew, drunken words exposed truths too raw to say out loud. He watched her rinse their mugs, the image of another man's hands on her body crawling into his mind, unwanted but vivid. The rest of the week passed in awkward detachment. They barely spoke. They shared the same bed but slept oceans apart. Mia moved through their apartment like a ghost, her laughter dimmed, her touch gone. Ethan was left to stew in his doubt, unsure if she had lied or worse if she had told the truth. Either way, trust had cracked, and the woman he loved had suddenly become a stranger. Ethan couldn't take it anymore, the quiet resentment, the way they tiptoed around each other like the truth hadn't already erupted between them. After another tense, wordless dinner where forks clinked louder than their conversation, he finally pushed his plate aside and looked across the table at Mia. "I need to know where we stand," he said, his voice steady but hollow. "Either we figure this out, or I'm done." Mia looked up sharply, her brows drawn. "Same," she snapped, bitterness riding her voice. "I'm sick of you watching me like I'm guilty of something." "Then just tell me the truth," he said, heart pounding. Her face twisted, her hands curling into fists around her napkin. "I don't even remember saying it," she muttered. "But you did say it," Ethan pressed, leaning forward. "And sometimes drunk people say the things they're too afraid to admit sober." Mia hesitated, then let out a slow breath, her gaze falling to her lap. "If it happened before we were married," she said, "does it even matter?" "It does if it was after," he said quietly. "Because then we have a problem." She met his eyes, and for a heartbeat, silence hung thick between them. Then she whispered, "Then I guess we have a problem, because I don't know why I said it." That was the breaking point. Trust, once fractured, doesn't crack with sound, it simply starts to rot in silence. And that night, they both realized, something between them had already started to die. The silence between Ethan and Mia stretched like a fault line ready to fracture. Days passed with barely a word between them, just routines executed without connection. They got dressed, made coffee, showed up at the restaurant they co-managed, exchanged logistical updates like business partners instead of spouses. The intimacy that had once bloomed between them had withered into glances that barely held eye contact. What stung most was the knowledge that Ethan had been planning something, a surprise, something romantic, a sign that he hadn't stopped loving her. He had been saving for a new car to give Mia for Christmas, a gesture to rekindle something. But now, with her half moved out, her toothbrush gone from their bathroom and her side of the closet suspiciously thinned, that gift felt like a cruel joke. What haunted Ethan wasn't just Mia's drunk confession about sleeping with Lucas Hayes, It was the uncertainty, the not knowing when or if it happened, the doubt worming into every quiet moment. He watched her at work from across the dining room, noticed how she lingered too long at certain tables, how she laughed a little too freely with patrons. Maybe he was being paranoid. Or maybe, just maybe, something had cracked wide open between them and there was no patching it. The worst part wasn't anger. It was the ache of betrayal wearing the mask of indifference. And as each day passed without clarity, Ethan felt like he was grieving someone who hadn't even left yet. The breaking point came over a dinner that should have brought them closer. Ethan had tried to act normal, cooked Mia's favorite pasta, lit a candle even though it felt ridiculous, and poured wine he could barely stomach. She sat across from him, eating in silence, eyes distant, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. The weight of everything unsaid thickened the air between them until it was unbearable. He watched her push food around her plate, and something inside him snapped. "I need to know where we stand," he said, voice low but sharp. "Either we figure this out, or I'm done." Mia didn't flinch. She set down her fork and met his gaze head-on, the spark of frustration finally surfacing. "Same," she said, her tone brittle. "I'm sick of you watching me like I'm guilty of something." Ethan's knuckles whitened around his glass. "Then tell me the truth." She hesitated for a heartbeat too long. "If it happened before we were married, does it really matter?" His chest tightened. "It matters if it was after." She sighed, looked away. "Then I guess we have a problem." That was the night everything unraveled. They stopped talking entirely. No more shared rides to work. No late-night conversations. They slept beside each other like strangers with a shared mortgage. Ethan had once believed that love could withstand silence, but not this. Not the kind that echoed through the apartment louder than any fight. Not the kind that made you question if the person lying next to you was already gone. Ethan's world tilted the morning Mia didn't show up for her shift. At first, he brushed it off. Maybe she'd overslept, maybe she needed a mental health day. But when he saw Katie covering Mia's usual tables, a sense of unease curled in his gut. "Why is Katie handling Mia's section?" he asked the manager, who barely looked up. "She called in sick." That was odd, but it was what came next that knocked the air from his lungs. "Actually, she called again later. Said she's quitting. Effective immediately." The words hit like a punch to the chest. Ethan barely remembered grabbing his coat and keys. His drive home was a blur, his hands trembling as they gripped the wheel. The apartment was silent, eerily so. Something was missing. No music, no humming from the kitchen, no scent of her citrus shampoo wafting through the hallway. Then he noticed the gaps. Her favorite jacket gone from the coat rack. Her shoes missing from their usual pile. Her vanity looked half empty. Panic tightened around his throat. He called her, no answer.
Kellet again. Still nothing.
In desperation, he rang her parents. Mia's father picked up, gruff and distant. "She's probably with Rachel," he said, voice clipped. "Fix it, Ethan, before it's too late." Then the line went dead. Ethan stood in the living room, staring at the space where her coffee mug used to be. His heart raced as the silence swallowed him. It was one thing to be angry, to feel betrayed. But this felt like she had already made up her mind to disappear. Days bled into each other, every hour haunted by the hollow silence Mia had left behind. Ethan couldn't concentrate at work. The clatter of dishes and hum of the restaurant became background noise to the storm inside him. Her absence was a weight he couldn't shake, a constant reminder that something precious had slipped through his fingers. One evening, restless and desperate, he found himself driving to Rachel's apartment. He hesitated before knocking, his breath fogging in the chill of night. When Rachel opened the door, her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look surprised. "She's not here," she said before he could ask. "But she's safe. That's all I can tell you." Frustration churned in Ethan's chest. "I just need to talk to her. One conversation." Rachel stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "She needs space, Ethan. She's hurting. And she's scared."
Of me?
He asked, voice cracking. "Of what you stopped being," Rachel replied gently. "She's not asking for perfection. Just honesty. Presence. Trust." Her words cut deeper than any argument ever could. Ethan stood frozen as Rachel's door shut again, leaving him alone under the porch light, the weight of regret pressing into his spine. He sat in his car for nearly an hour afterward, staring at the dashboard, playing every memory of Mia on a loop, her laughter, the way she looked at him before everything broke, and the quiet sadness in her eyes he never truly saw until she was gone. That night, he realized, this wasn't just a mistake. This was a wake-up call. The silence in the apartment had a different quality now, one that didn't just echo but pressed, like a presence of its own. Ethan found himself pacing more than sitting, checking his phone compulsively, staring at the door like it might open if he willed it hard enough. On a particularly still evening, a knock finally came, not the rapid, urgent kind, but soft, uncertain. He opened the door to find Mia standing there, arms crossed over her chest, her face guarded but not cold. She looked tired, older somehow, like the weight of heartbreak had settled into her bones. "Can I come in?" she asked. He stepped aside wordlessly. They sat across from each other at the dining table they'd once shared late-night takeout on, the silence between them thick with everything unsaid. Ethan reached for her hand but stopped himself. "I miss you," he said, his voice cracking under the confession. Mia looked down, her fingers knotted together. "You didn't trust me," she whispered. "You built a whole truth out of one drunken sentence and never gave me the chance to explain." "I was scared," he admitted. "And that fear made me someone I don't want to be." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then quietly, "I didn't leave because of the mistake. I left because you stopped seeing me." The words shattered him. But there was no anger in her voice, only truth. That night, they didn't fix everything. But they started to speak again, not as a couple, but as two people who still, deep down, wanted to believe in each other. The days that followed were cautious steps across fragile ground. Ethan and Mia began to talk, not in bursts of confrontation, but in quiet, vulnerable pieces of conversation that built slowly, like layers of sediment settling after a storm. They didn't rush. They didn't pretend. Instead, they acknowledged the fractures between them and chose, one moment at a time, to face them together. One night, while sitting on the couch watching a movie neither was really paying attention to, Mia reached over and rested her head on Ethan's shoulder. He didn't speak, just pulled her closer. It was the first touch that didn't feel haunted by doubt. Ethan started therapy. It wasn't Mia's idea, it wasn't even hers to suggest. It came from a realization that he needed to understand why he spiraled so quickly into suspicion, why one slip of drunken speech unraveled the foundation of his trust. Mia noticed the change. The way he listened differently. The way he asked her how she felt and actually waited to hear the answer. She too began letting go, of the fear, the defensiveness, the shame of having been pushed away and not believed. They still had hard days. There were moments when a memory stung or silence lingered too long. But they faced those moments together now. Slowly, something new began to form, not a return to what they had before, but the beginning of something stronger. Something earned. It wasn't perfect. It was real. And real, they were learning, was enough to start again. One Friday night, as a quiet breeze swept through the city and the weight of the past months seemed lighter somehow, Ethan found himself standing once again outside the bar where it had all begun. The misty shore hadn't changed, same flickering neon sign, same thump of bass pulsing from inside, but everything inside him had. He wasn't here to chase ghosts or test Mia's words, he was here to see with clarity what he once couldn't. And there he was, Lucas Hayes.
Alone this time.
No seductive grin, no magnetic confidence. Just a man hunched over his drink, his expression unreadable, his charm worn thin. Ethan watched from afar, and for the first time, there was no anger, no jealousy. There was just understanding. Lucas had never been the true threat to his marriage. The real threat had been the unspoken distance between him and Mia, the erosion of attention, of care. Ethan saw it now, the nights he let routine replace romance, the days he chose silence over connection. Lucas may have sparked a flame, but Ethan had left the wick exposed. He didn't approach him. He didn't need to. Instead, he turned and walked out of the bar, back into the night, back toward the future he was building again. The man who had once lost himself in suspicion now walked with quiet confidence, knowing that the only thing that mattered wasn't who Mia had smiled at or danced with, it was who she came home to. And this time, Ethan would make sure that was always him. The knock came on a rainy Sunday evening, soft, hesitant, like the weight behind it was heavier than the sound. Ethan opened the door, and there she was. Mia stood in the hallway, hair damp from the drizzle, eyes searching his face like she was looking for the version of him she remembered. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't have to. Her presence said it all. He stepped aside, heart pounding, and she walked in, not just into the apartment, but into the raw, vulnerable space between them they had both tiptoed around for weeks. "I'm ready to come home," she whispered, setting down her bag with trembling hands. Ethan didn't speak. He simply wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her shoulder, breathing her in like he'd been starved of oxygen. They didn't need a grand declaration. That moment was its own vow. The next few weeks were fragile, like walking on glass. They avoided landmines, talked slowly, honestly. Trust wasn't rebuilt overnight, but piece by piece. Ethan started therapy, not just for her, but for himself. To understand his own fear, his own darkness.
Mia noticed.
She smiled more. She hummed in the kitchen again. One night, she left a note on his pillow, just 4 words, "Thank you for staying." He tucked it into his wallet like a treasure. They weren't perfect. But they were trying, really trying. And in this fragile, forgiving space they now shared, Ethan realized something simple, powerful, and terrifying. Love wasn't just worth fighting for. It was worth becoming better for. They say time heals, but Ethan quickly learned it doesn't do the work for you, it only gives you the space to try. In the months after Mia returned home, their life began to resemble something both familiar and brand new. Gone were the unspoken assumptions and routine complacency that had once defined their days.
Now, ever Konversation mattert, ever small act hält Intention.
They walked slower, listened longer, touched more gently. The brokenness hadn't disappeared, but it had softened, become something they could acknowledge without flinching. Mia started painting again, turning their spare room into a makeshift studio. Ethan would sometimes stand in the doorway, watching her mix colors like she was piecing herself back together on the canvas. She'd glance up, offer him a soft smile, and he'd feel the stir of something he thought he'd lost forever, hope. Meanwhile, Ethan stayed committed to his therapy, confronting the insecurities that once poisoned his trust.
Mia noticed.
She told him one night, over quiet music and a half-finished bottle of wine, "You're becoming the man I always knew was there." Their intimacy returned, slowly and carefully, like rain after a drought. No longer just about passion, it became a reaffirmation, a wordless promise. Every kiss whispered, "We're still here." And that mattered more than any grand gesture. They weren't aiming for perfection anymore. They were aiming for presence, for choosing each other day after day, especially when it wasn't easy. And in that quiet, steady rhythm, they began to fall in love all over again, this time, with eyes wide open. It was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind that once passed unnoticed in the haze of old routines, but now felt precious, earned. Ethan brewed coffee while Mia hummed in the living room, flipping through a worn photo album they hadn't touched in years. Outside, the world moved slowly, and for once, they didn't feel the need to rush to catch up. It had been a long road, painful, uncertain, full of nights that stretched too long and words that hurt more than either of them wanted to admit. But here they were, still standing. Not the same as before. Better. Mia looked up as Ethan walked in, her eyes holding that same spark he had fallen for, dimmed for a while but never lost. She patted the spot beside her, and he joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. They sat there in silence, flipping pages filled with frozen smiles and faded memories. "We almost lost all this," she whispered, her voice soft. Ethan nodded, tightening his hold. "I know. But we didn't. We chose to fight for it." That was the heart of it all. Love wasn't just a feeling, it was a decision, a commitment to rebuild even when the foundation had cracked. It was showing up, even when it was hard. Forgiving, even when it stung. Trusting, even when fear still lingered. As they leaned into each other, hearts no longer guarded but open, they both knew, what they had now wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that made it worth everything. In today's fast-paced world, where careers, stress, and distractions often take center stage, it's easy for emotional distance to quietly grow in relationships. The story of Ethan and Mia reminds us that trust, communication, and emotional presence are more vital than grand romantic gestures. Don't wait for a crisis to address the growing silence. Talk, listen, and be intentional. Make time for your partner, not just physically, but emotionally. If doubt creeps in, Confront it with honesty, not suspicion. Relationships thrive not on perfection, but on effort. Choose each other, every day, especially when it's hard. That's how lasting love is built.